Hi, everyone. I'm Elena Quiroz-Livanis, Chief of Staff and Assistant Commissioner for Academic Policy and Student Success at the Massachusetts Department of Higher Education.
And I'm Christine Williams, the Assistant Commissioner for Regulatory Affairs and Strategic Initiatives at the Massachusetts Department of Higher Education.
And today we're going to be speaking about the Massachusetts Equity Agenda. Thrilled to have received this invitation by Complete College America. So just to give you a sense, we're going to be focusing on our racial equity principles and just have a conversation between the two of us about how we're approaching this work at the Massachusetts Department of Higher Ed. And before getting into our racial equity principles, we thought it would be helpful to just give you a little bit of background on our work. And like I said, this is really just going to be a conversation that Christine and I are having. So Christine, feel free to jump in at any point. But I think it's really important to talk about kind of where this work started as an agency, which was really, if you think about it, the commissioner released his working paper in 2019 after the board adopted this vision for advancing equity in post-secondary education, which is really when the board said that this was going to be their top policy and performance priority. So Commissioner wrote this working paper, and that's our Commissioner Carlos Santiago. But then, you know, we applied for a grant, which was the Lumina Foundation Equity Leadership Acceleration Grant, and we received some funds to do professional development, right, with the University of Southern California's Race and Equity Center, which is led by Dr. Sean Harper. And we brought all of our staff together for a series of 4 days to do mandatory professional development. So Christine, I'm wondering, you know, what was that like being in that space with all of our DHE colleagues? I kind of see that as really kind of being the first time that we brought everyone together and said, this is what we're doing. This is going to be the top policy and performance priority. All of the other stuff that we've been working on remains really important, but this is kind of going to be it. This is going to be the main focus of the department. What did it feel being in that space, you know, with 65 other people from the DHE having conversations about racial equity?
Yeah, it was really, really powerful. And I feel so grateful that, you know, that the commissioner really focused on creating that space for us, because I do feel like it laid the foundation for everything that we've done since and for how we sort of see the work moving forward. And it also just sort of reminded all of us that literally every single person in the department has to be part of this work. And I think that that was really a powerful way to sort of build cohesion as a team. And I think, you know, the other thing is it made us, for me personally, it was a way to sort of kind of really be in this conversation, particularly as a white person with our like colleagues of color, like to be in this like very honest and straightforward sort of conversation about, you know, how frankly racism plays out in our work, but then also how that can play out in our workplace. And I think that's been a powerful way to make sure that we're sort of walking the walk as we do our work and as we relate to each other. And it's sort of helped conversations among staff too. And so, yeah, it really feels foundational to this work actually. And making sure that we're sort of moving from this really authentic place actually, and not just, you know, paying lip service to the work.
Yeah, I had like a very similar reaction, and it almost felt like we wouldn't be where we are with the equity agenda if we hadn't done that professional development. I don't think we could have, to your point, authentically have started this work if we hadn't engaged in that type of professional development where we were oftentimes talking about racial equity in the context of our public institutions, but not so much within our agency. And I think it allowed us as staff to kind of pause and say we have to do both. Like we have to focus on producing more racially equitable student outcomes in partnership and collaboration with the public institutions, but that at the same time, we need to have this type of climate and culture within our own organization where, you know, we're asking institutions to make sure that students of color feel valued and welcome on campus. Like that has to be the same type of vibe within our own agency, and we have to give voice to Black and Brown staff to make sure that we are valuing their experiences the same way that we want students to feel like they're valued when they go to one of our campuses. And I feel like there was a really big cultural shift after that moment. And then the other thing that I was really kind of proud of was there were 6 groups, right, that came together and they were working on different projects. But one of those groups was a sustaining professional learning and training group. And that has probably been the group that has continued to push this agenda internally, to an extent that like you don't always know what it's going to be like. You're like, oh, PD is like a one and done kind of,
Right.
but all of a sudden you have that group that I just mentioned, which we affectionately call SPLAT at DHE, is continually like putting things together for us, like the book club that we now have, and we're starting with how to be an anti-racist, and the department is covering, you know, the cost of those books, because it's just another way to show the commitment to advancing racial equity within and outside of our organization.
Right.
So
Right.
sharing your thoughts on that, and I'm thinking now is probably a good time to jump into our racial equity principles.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
and also sort of a, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, a nice segue too is, I think, into these principles, is that part of what happened in those sessions was also that there was this like new vocabulary for folks, and I think we're now able to speak a different kind of language with each other because of that experience. And I think, like, you know, really acknowledging that it takes space to kind of, like, the language is evolving even now, and so like having that space for people to feel comfortable, like not necessarily understanding language, understanding it's really important, and then sort of figuring out how to make that into something that really lives and breathes in our work, which I think these principles really are and reflect. So
no, that's a great segue. And we also did start developing these principles live during our time together when we were in the Equity Institutes. And like you said, the language just kept evolving. Not only during those 4 days, when I think, you know, one of the most obvious examples is we stop calling students, you know, being a part of a minority group, but now we reference them as being racially minoritized, because this is an act that has been thrusted upon them. And realistically, Black and Brown students are not the global minority, right? Like we're the global majority, and yet it's just contextualized in this Western way, which really perpetuates the type of oppression that students of color feel when they get to our campuses, or realistically, like out in the broader world, right? Like this is not just a higher ed problem. This is just like a Western culture problem, but our scope remains within, you know, the frame of higher education. So I think you're right that the work that we did pushes us to continuously evolve and not just be satisfied with where we are right now. And because we did the PD, we can then have conversations with one another to kind of say, like, hey, maybe we shouldn't be framing things this way. We should stop putting the onus on the student and start putting the onus on the institution. And people are really receptive to that type of feedback, which I don't think would have been necessarily possible without that professional development.
Yeah, totally agreed.
So do you want to walk us through some of the first principles that we see on the screen?
Yeah, sure. So so these principles, which again, as you said, were sort of developed, started to be developed during those sessions, and we've sort of sharpened them a little bit since then. But really the way to sort of ground our work, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about what that is going to mean. But really just sort of starting from the get-go that this is our top performance priority, that literally that racial equity is what we do, because we know that the way to address basically all of the inequities that exist in public higher education is to focus on racial equity as our priority. And I just know I'm super proud that our commissioner has sort of put that stake in the ground, and that's where we're leading from. So that feels fundamental. And making sure that what that means is that race doesn't determine the outcomes of our students. And we know right now, based on our data, that that's the reality. And so, and also sort of thinking about this, as you kind of alluded to earlier, that this is really kind of system-wide. It's across our community colleges, state universities, our UMass campuses, and then also sort of permeates our own departmental structure and, right, like culture and policies, as we kind of like that whole sort of connection between what we do with each other, as the way we relate to each other within the department impacts the entire system and impacts our students, and sort of really being accountable to that.
And I think one of the really important things with this principle is that almost that last piece around policies, right? Because oftentimes it's like, well, where do we even start? Like when you have an equity agenda, like,
right.
where I think we're both chuckling because the idea of advancing something that is this big can feel really overwhelming at times, and you don't know what the starting point is. And I think the starting point for us was internal in many ways. Like we made the case, and that was like the pre part, because I think we've always had data to tell us that there are racial disparities throughout all levels of education, and it really takes leadership, and I feel like I've said this before, to act on the data, because the data aren't new. And so then once leadership makes the case and you start really ushering in what we've been describing as a cultural transformation at the DHE, it's like, then what? And so what the next step for us is this policy and program audit, which we just finished developing. I'm looking at it now. It's a 45-page manual that we were able to put together, which is, I think, really impressive, like as a department. So there were people from our research and planning team, there were people from academic affairs, there were people from fiscal, there were people from financial aid, there was all of the different units within our department were represented on this team that put a policy and program audit manual together that really makes staff question, the origin of the policy. Was it intended to be exclusionary? How do you remedy any racial injustice that may have been caused by your policy or program? How is it reflected in the budget? Like, how are we making sure that if we say that this is a priority, then it then translates into actually increasing resources for Black and Brown students and for Black and Brown faculty? How does this recognize the lived experiences of Black and Brown students? And so I'm really excited about the fact that we've been able to develop this audit manual, which in many ways, similar to these principles, that was informed by the work of the Center for Urban Education out of USC, right? Like, so when you think about the concept of equity mindedness, a lot of those principles, which there are 5, I think are embedded throughout our work, but then we also took their work around how to develop a policy audit and translated that into our own. And so the principles that folks are seeing on their screen and on the next slide actually then translate into review standards. And so staff, like we're staff who will have to go ahead, you'll have to audit, the early college policies. I'll have to audit developmental education and transfer policies. And hopefully by the end of it, we'll have some new policies. And we're not talking about reform, we're talking about transformation, right? So like that our policy scheme will be totally transformed in order to really advance the equity agenda, and not just letting these policies, some of them which are new, some of them which are 30 years old, but not letting those stand in the way of the work that we're trying to do. And so I think that I'm excited that that's kind of like the place where we're going to be starting that work. And one of the, going on to the next principle is like using asset-based language, which is probably one of my favorite principles, because it speaks to what you were talking about earlier, which is really changing the way we talk about students. And I don't think that's one of the most powerful things that I think we can do, is really stop using deficit-based language and bringing up the fact that our students not only using asset-based language, but then seeing them as assets, seeing them as people, whole people who bring like a host of cultural wealth to our institutions. And really, we're the ones that are better for it.
Yeah, right. And I think it's also related to, when I was first introduced to the concept of asset-based language and then realizing how like ubiquitous, frankly, like deficit-based language is in education, and frankly, all the way from pre-K all the way through higher ed, like that sort of, and that's why I think language is so essential, because it totally, when you start noticing it and thinking in different ways and using different language, it totally transforms the way you think about it. And you realize, the language we all use centers whiteness, in culture generally centers whiteness, reinforces white supremacy, reinforces systemic racism. And really, I think the only way to undo it, or an essential part of undoing it, requires changing the way we speak and even just think about the world we live in and how we walk. And I think that's sort of related to the I'm also obviously super thrilled about the policy audit, because I think similarly, we can talk about breaking down and dismantling systemic racism, till the cows come home, as they say. Like, we can keep talking about it, but unless we actually fully interrogate our policies and recognize that it's all created by, that systemic racism has been reinforced in our policy. It exists literally everywhere. So we really have to sort of do I think we have to be super disciplined about how we break down literally everything that we do in order to make sure that we're, to your point, like truly having a cultural transformation. So, right, yeah, these two are, all of the principles are really important, but these two are really, just feel like they kind of are fundamental to how we've thought about shaping this work. And honestly, like, I have to credit, I feel like I have to credit you, and in many ways, you have sort of brought like new language to me, which has completely changed my own thinking. And that's been, I don't think I couldn't do this work well without that shift. So I have a lot of gratitude for that.
I have to credit the UMass Boston Higher Education doctoral program. That's one of the fun things of being in a full-time doc program while doing this work, is that, you're taking what you're learning and putting it into practice. And while there's a point where you have to reflect before you bring it into practice, I'm really grateful that I personally have that opportunity. And I think that's the other thing that makes this work what not necessarily unique, but really powerful, is that it's also rooted in research, right? So like, I think about Yaso's cultural wealth framework. Like, I think about work that folks like Cheryl Ching and Adrian Trinidad and Eric Felix have done around like how race gets diluted in policy. I think about the work of folks like Ball and Levinson and Marshall, who talk about like critical policy analysis. And really then, like, that's the type of stuff, ironically, that we're doing as policymakers. So not so much as like researchers that are then critically analyzing policy, but like as policymakers ourselves, what we have said is that we have the will to policy in an equity-minded way. And I think we're very fortunate that we get to work in this environment because of the leadership that we have.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that kind of takes us then to like, what are the things that we must do? And in so many ways, they're related, right? So like the first one is recognizing clarity in language goals and measures is vital to racially equitable practices. In turn, those also then have to be framed in an asset-based way. Because again, the data has always been there, but that's only a certain type of data, right? Like, there's always been, I think, this kind of obsession with the concept of like objectivity in higher education and research in higher education. And that's just like one that's not very real. there's no way that it's not subjective in many ways. But then too, that has also meant that we've kind of overemphasized quantitative data for a very long time without like stopping to just ask students, and particularly
Right.
Black and brown students or Black and brown faculty or Black and brown administrators and staff, what does it feel like to be on your campus? And that could explain so many things. I mean, it does explain so many things. And so I think not only using our data dashboards that we have to say, you know, these are our current metrics, developing new metrics, which we'll have to do and kind of redefine success in a way that is more applicable to our students. But then also saying like, hey, there's some really valuable qualitative data out there that we have to start collecting and honoring and valuing and putting up at the forefront.
Yeah. And I think actually, you know, it's as much as higher ed and our data and everything else has so centered whiteness, I think that white folks really have to do like that qualitative data is that much more important, because the thing about whiteness is it's blindness, right? That my lived experience doesn't reflect racism, right? Like I can see it in the way that I can recognize it, but I haven't personally experienced it. So my college experience didn't involve, you know, like the traumas that most students of color experience. So I think that particular point is really important, I think, for white folks trying to do this work, because we like don't have the lived experience, and all of us really have to understand too what the lived experience is of current students of color now, in this particular environment. So it's incumbent on all of us, but I think that particular point is an important one. And one real quick thing I just wanted to make sure we don't lose is, I think it was on the prior slide, really remembering that, and again, I credit you with some of this language, but remembering that doing this work also requires repairing harm that sort of students of color have been excluded from higher ed very explicitly for you know, a long history. And so I know you introduced me to the term educational debt, and sort of, and when we think about educational justice, it requires us knowing that we're in debt to students of color who have been excluded in so many different ways from higher ed, from education and from higher ed specifically. So I think our principle is that it requires acknowledgement, remedy, and repair of the policies and practices that were formulated for the purposes of exclusion. And also even those policies that people think are sort of innocuous or race neutral, that we know actually have excluded students of color. So
yeah, I mean, I think about, that's exactly right. And that goes back to like appropriate terminology, because that's really where, you know, education debt came from, was as a response to this gap language.
right.
So when you start to use a term like education debt, you know, even internally, there's been some conversation around like, well, that might be confusing. People might think about that as student debt. And it's like, well, let's use that as an opportunity to say like, okay, student debt is when you take out money, you take out a loan, and then you have to repay it. This education debt is the same thing. As a society, we have basically robbed people of color the opportunity to access and succeed in post-secondary education. That is now a debt that we as a society owe to them. And that's in this context of higher ed, but there's economic debt, you know, there's historical debt, there's so many different types of debt, but the language we use has to be so precise so that people know who is responsible for the change. Because at the end of the day, we're not asking students to change, we're asking our system to change. And that's, I think, really, really important to kind of just hone in on. Is this isn't about tweaking around the edges. Like if you pay close attention to these, they're actually very interwoven, which really leads to a systemic overhaul and a systemic transformation. And so the way that, you know, the clarity and language and goals, when we're talking about qualitative data, that kind of bleeds into the next one, which is culturally sustainable campus climates. And that's where I think about research by like Sam Musais, who really talked about culturally engaging campus environments. And so that's, how are you going to know without asking the students? And then how do you then take what you learn to then create and cultivate an inclusive environment and then set goals to do that? Like, it can't just be a campus climate survey that's put in a glossy, I'm thinking of like one of those nice ring bound documents that sits on a shelf. Like, it can't be that. It has to be something that is used to inform. And now I'm getting excited because they just kind of all go into one another. But the results of the campus climate survey really have to inform the work that you do on your campus. Like, if your students are telling you that they're experiencing microaggressions in the bursar's office or in the classroom, that has to be addressed. And at the same time, we have to give folks in those roles the resources to kind of do the work themselves. And I think that's one of the things that's like pretty important, is you have to kind of do the data collection, you have to do the analysis, but then you kind of have to put your money where your mouth is and really kind of start to change the way budgeting gets done, like start to really provide the professional development, and give people the opportunity to grow. Because otherwise, and I think it just becomes this unfunded mandate. And I think about our community colleges, like in particular, they're the least resourced segment within public higher education, yet they're the best poised to do this work.
And that really begs the question. I mean, I think, I know we're sort of talking about what we're doing internally, but it reminds me and us, and frankly, hopefully a lot more people, that we have to keep talking about what public higher education is and should be and must be. And to your point, if we're saying that we're in this debt to students of color, and yet the segment that serves the most students of color in the Commonwealth is getting the smallest amount of our investments, then we're exacerbating systemic racism. Like, that's just so, yeah. And I love that, like, budgets have to reflect our values. And if our value and our priority is racial equity, then we have some serious questions to ask about budgets. So
yeah, and I think it's historical. Like, there's so much where I think a basic understanding of the history of higher ed could go a very long way for people, especially if you're using an equity-minded lens to just kind of interrogate why things happened the way they happened and when they happened. It could really kind of shed light on why things look the way they do today and why they can no longer continue to look that way if we're going to have a racially just post-secondary system in our state. So I think that leads, the final two here is experiencing and acknowledging people of color. That's when it's kind of related to what we've been talking about, and the way that we talk about it too in the agency is when we talk about like our work with community engagement, really engaging communities and letting them tell us what it is that they need, especially as our institutions in so many ways are anchor institutions, rather than us telling them what we think they need. Like, that goes against all of it. And I think part of that goes to redefining some of evidence-based solutions. Like, what does that mean to the people that we're trying to do better by, and not just things, that are published in these peer-reviewed journals with like small samples. Like, that work remains valuable, but redefining evidence, I think, is going to be really important for us, because that's just going to acknowledge that there are different types of knowledge, particularly in communities of color, that need to be more greatly valued.
Right, absolutely. And also, I think valuing our public higher education institutions as part of the community, and understanding that there cannot be a division between the higher institution and the community as a whole. And that also means like thinking about delivering education and students as whole people, right? So, what's going on in criminal justice or housing or any issue, really, health, all of that is sort of connected to the wholeness of our our communities and also sort of the wholeness of our students. So I guess it's not embedded here, but that's sort of understood in sort of the way that we think about this too.
Yeah, thanks for raising that, because that is in the work that we're doing internally with the policy audit and some other projects. That's the language that we're using, right? Is like looking at the whole student and not just focusing on this like academic curricular piece of it, because we're as human beings, we're much more complicated than that. Christine, I want to thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. I'm so glad that we get to do this work together. And if folks have questions, please feel free to reach out. We'll make sure to include our email addresses and look forward to connecting with others who are interested in advancing racial equity in higher education. Thanks for watching, everyone.
Thank you.